Hello, and welcome to VMware Tanzu Office Hours. Today, we'll be doing recommendations for managing Kubernetes clusters at scale, leveraging Tanzu Mission Control. My name is Ryan Conley. I'm a senior staff platform architect based in San Francisco. I've been with the company 8 years, and I've had the pleasure of learning from some of the fastest growing startups in the Bay Area. My co-presenter is Morgan Fine.
Thanks, Ryan. As Ryan said, I'm Morgan Fine. I'm a group product line manager on Tanzu Mission Control. I've been with the team for 2.5 years now, and I'm really excited to kind of be sharing some of the things we've seen from our customers and a few common gotchas and areas to improve. So when we kick off, we kind of want to kick off with a few questions just to get to know who's here, what you're doing with Kubernetes. So question one is pretty easy. You should have a polling capability. How many clusters are in your Kubernetes footprint today? 0 to 5, 6 to 20, 21 to 50, or more than 50? And then I'll jump. You can see there should be a second question coming up in a minute. What Kubernetes distributions are you using? And you can check as many as are applicable to you. EKS, AKS, GKE, bare metal, TKG, or something we haven't listed. Give you all a minute or two to fill that out, and then we can share the results in a second. So looks like 4 out of 5 of you have somewhere in the range of 0 to 5 clusters. And the remaining 20% of you have 6 to 20 clusters. So a little newer or not as big of a Kubernetes fleet. And then the distribution's interesting as well. Majority using TKG. Then the remaining split between other and bare metal. And so it's really helpful. We can use this to kind of say, hey, how do you get started with Tanzu Mission Control? And really highlight some of the day zero and the benefits that TMC can bring to the table, regardless of where you are in your Kubernetes journey. So thank you for sharing and helping with that. Let's jump in. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about what we call the Tanzu Mission Control data model. This is this concept of cluster groups and workspaces and the benefit they bring to the table. After that, I'll be sharing how to attach a cluster and kind of some of the first things you want to do after you've attached a cluster and setting up access policies and beyond that. And then I'll pass it over to Ryan, who's going to give us a demo on some of the things I'm going to talk about. And we'll talk through some common issues and, of course, share resources that you can do to kind of self-service and keep going if you want to learn more about this topic. And then at the end, we have an official Q&A session. But like I said, if anything comes up throughout that you want us to dive into, please drop it in the Q&A and we can spend a little bit of time on that. All right, so Tanzu Mission Control data model. When we're thinking about Tanzu Mission Control, we really think about it as this two-tiered hierarchy. And you can see that represented in the middle, where within your Tanzu Mission Control instance, you have this concept of workspaces and this concept of cluster groups. Workspaces are a logical grouping of namespaces, and cluster groups are, well, a logical grouping of clusters. And the benefit for both of these is they allow both platform operators and application teams to operate and control the resources they care most about in seamless and efficient ways, regardless of the scale. And so one of the benefits is you can start with a single cluster group and workspace, and you can easily add more to ensure that you're able to easily apply policy or manage the fleet or single clusters that you have in a consistent way. The other benefit with this is really through these hierarchy and data model, you have an ability to create more of a self-service and tailored experience, which means less IT tickets, less help desk and security team involvement, and more peace of mind that the clusters and namespaces that you have in your TMC fleet will be consistent and easy to manage regardless of where they're running or how they're configured. And so one of the really cool parts with this is how you can use Tanzu Mission Control to apply what we call like the security framework or consistently manage security policies on any number of clusters or specific resources within the clusters. So using the TMC data model and our security framework, you can easily apply policies to one cluster or to many clusters, regardless of where those clusters are running. They could all be in the cloud, they could be on-premise, or it could be a mixture. We don't care, TMC doesn't care. As long as they're CN/CF conformant, it all works perfectly. Beyond that, sometimes you need to set up specific controls or configurations on maybe a namespace or a resource within a cluster and not be quite so wide tooth comb as just a single cluster or cluster group. And so within that, the security framework enables you to set pod security context or context and security controls on a specific namespace or a set of resources that match a label. And all of this really enables you to set up your fleet so that you know whatever controls you might have or need to put in place. It's really trivially easy to do that in a automatable and repeatable way that doesn't require you to manually run a bunch of scripts or manually click through a UI over and over.
And we don't want to steal too much of our next session. So the Tanzu Office Hours that's following us will be led by Corey Dinkins, who's also on the panel today. And he will dive much deeper into some of the options within policies. But for today's session, particularly those that are getting started with a handful of Kubernetes clusters, there are very simple policies you can state that will lay the groundwork. So for example, what is your strategy for replacing the pod security policies that are now deprecated in Kubernetes? Or how can you very easily prevent privileged containers or root access to your containers? All these can be done with a single policy, and every cluster that gets provisioned will meet those standards. And so while you may only have a handful of clusters today, think about how you'll manage and simplify the operations at scale. So I relate this to essentially VMs from 20 years ago, where what starts with a handful of operations to get started to deploy a couple of clusters. In the future, you'll probably have ephemeral clusters or a large scale of clusters. So how do you manage something at the scale of 10,000 clusters, for example?
One of the things that I really like that I want to highlight since I saw here is this dry run mode. One of the things our customers have appreciated is sometimes a new policy comes out or a new rule that you have to adhere to comes out. And you want to make sure that you're not going to violate it and break a bunch of apps when you start enforcing that rule. And so one of the things that Tanzu Mission Control enables you to do is this dry run mode or this audit mode. And so you can easily configure and create the policy, but not actually enforce it, and just have a easy insights tab to quickly see what is violating it before you actually turn it into enforce mode. But for today's session, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about identity and access policy, and then how to get your first cluster under management. And so I talked a bit about this before, but I'm personally visual, so this slide helps me understand it. We have these two trees. We have this cluster group tree and this workspace tree. And regardless of which tree you care about or the granularity that your team needs access to different resources, Tanzu Mission Control lets you set access policies on any level of this tree on either side. And so that means maybe you can set up a dev, a staging, and a production cluster group for a specific team. And the development team might have full admin access to development cluster group, but maybe we want to give them only read access to production, or maybe no access at all and lock it down to the IT team. On a similar space, maybe we want to only give Ryan's team access to a specific namespace in a specific cluster for a short period of time. Using the Tanzu Mission Control identity and access policy, which you can federate against your IDP. That's actually really easy. And that means I can give Ryan access or his team access to the specific resources, or give him access to manage the resources for his own team. And so from this, let's kind of jump in and talk a little bit. Okay, great. This is all awesome, but it's only great if I have a cluster under management. So how do we get that first cluster in? And TMC supports something that we call attaching a cluster. And attaching a cluster is basically, hey, I already have a cluster or many clusters running somewhere in the cloud, somewhere on premise, and I want to bring it in. I'm not necessarily looking to start fresh with Kubernetes. I just want to start using TMC to manage my clusters. And so I'm using the Tanzu Mission Control UI here to show this, but this is all controllable through the CLI or the API. It's pretty simple. You start with saying, hey, Tanzu Mission Control, here's the name of the cluster. Here's how I want to identify it. I choose which cluster group, like we talked about, I want to put that cluster in. So maybe it's the cluster for the billing team. So I would put it in the billing cluster group. I then would optionally configure a proxy if I'm using a nuanced or network limited environment. And then Tanzu Mission Control would generate this deployment YAML, which I easily can copy and run and apply to my cluster. And that would install the Tanzu Mission Control agent onto the cluster. That agent gives TMC full access to the cluster and lets us take control and have all the management capabilities that we're talking about here and kind of the rest that we aren't necessarily talking about in this session. If a slightly deeper dive into what this process actually looks like and how it works. Once you've kind of got that cluster running, you want to attach it. And so step one is the operations team would log in to Tanzu Mission Control. They would authenticate to the cluster, and that would have the cluster reach out and generate or fetch the CSP token or the auth token to validate that the user should actually have access to the cluster and to TMC. That gets them that YAML that we talked about, which they would then be able to use to apply and run onto the cluster. Once they've run it against the cluster, you can see that we install this VMware system TMC namespace into the cluster, which installs all the various Tanzu Mission Control agents that are responsible for managing the cluster health, keeping the agents up to date, and kind of ET phoning home and sending data back to Tanzu Mission Control. And that's really where step 4 comes in, which is ensuring that Tanzu Mission Control has an up-to-date view of your cluster so that you know that any issues show up in the TMC UI, and you can easily see what issues might come up or what controls you might want to put in place that aren't there. And so one of the things that I've seen quite a bit, and I'm sure Ryan's seen in the field too, that comes up is, hey, I just did all this. I installed the TMC agent and it's not working. Like, what happens? What's going on? And by and large, the biggest issue that I've seen that's an issue is network connectivity. We designed the TMC agent to only require egress from the cluster back to Tanzu Mission Control. And this is really because we know ingress into your data centers or into your private subnets is a hard thing to ask for. But oftentimes we still need to make sure that egress back exists. And in many cases, we need a way to connect back. And that's where this concept of a proxy comes in. And so, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to click that. A proxy is basically a configuration you can put in Tanzu Mission Control, which Ryan will demo in a bit. And that gives you the ability for the agent and any connectivity that TMC is putting on the cluster to transgress through the proxy configuration and back to Tanzu Mission Control. And that basically says, great, I can deploy the cluster into an air-gapped and locked down environment, but not worry that I need a way back to TMC. So quick review of how to assign an access policy from a UI screenshots, and then I'm going to pass it over to Ryan to actually show you how this works in real life. So this is a view of the access management policy tree in Tanzu Mission Control. You can see on the left kind of where that bullet 1 is the list of all the cluster groups in my organization. So step 1 is picking what level of access and what resource do I want to set that policy at. Step 2 is kind of reviewing what are all the policies that have been set in the tree so far or on that resource. And then step 3 is figuring out what is the specific role. Is it cluster edit? Is it cluster admin? Is it cluster view that I want to set? And then choosing if I'm giving it to a specific user or a specific group, and then clicking save. And from there, the TMC agent should inherit and fetch the configuration that you just set, and the appropriate individuals who match the criteria you set will have that level of access. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ryan, who's going to actually jump into a demo.
So I've logged into Mission Control, and we'll just kind of start at the very beginning. But for those who are new and are still learning, a common ask that we see in the field is just how do I understand some of the concepts that we've been talking about in the deck. So we've recently added the Launchpad to help our customers learn and prepare. So this is available. And then as we talk about some of the common asks, Morgan did a good job of talking about the data model. So the cluster group, the grouping of policies for common clusters, and something else we'll see in a little bit is the grouping of namespaces, which we call workspaces. And we were just talking about access, which is a common ask. So while I understand several of you all have a handful of clusters today, think about how you're going to manage mini clusters at scale. And you can do this with your existing identity provider or IDP on the slide. So for many, their source of truth, that attestation of access comes from Active Directory, but it could be LDAP. We can do that through the top level, which is the VMware Cloud Services Portal, or CSP. And Mission Control is one of the services that CSP provides in terms of the VMware Cloud Services. So I consider the CSP as the bank, and then in this case, my checking could be a service, or Mission Control could be the service. And from that, the identity provider down, you can start assigning access policies. And so if we select access, we now see that same data model. We have cluster groups, and then we have workspaces. So grouping of namespaces or grouping of clusters. And then as Morgan showed, we can select and apply policy now for a group of clusters or a group of workspaces. In this case, I can select my name, and then I just started the process of attaching this cluster. And now we can have inheritable policies. And this is where you can choose what sort of permissions you want to assign. So for example, we can create Kubernetes role-based access controls, and all these can be propagated down from your source of truth down into the Kubernetes clusters, providing the both visibility for audit, as well as the simplified control of just at scale, I want this automatically to happen. And when I say automatically, this is where your teams can decide. You can decide, do you want to give people individual access to just create a namespaces? Maybe you want to give them view access for InfoSec for auditing, or maybe you want to give them a higher level control because they're more mature Kubernetes users. An example could be someone who's writing their own Kubernetes operators. They will need more than just the access to create a cluster, to create a namespace. They'll need a higher level Kubernetes access so they can create operators for, let's say, chaos testing on their application, or maybe they want to integrate an existing homegrown provisioning system with Mission Control, or do something else. That's kind of the beauty of Kubernetes. They can create their own reconciliation loops. And so that's how you can apply, and all these can come from your identity provider here. So for example, I can type my name, and it's going to pull down from your identity provider, and then you can click add. And now that policy has been implemented at the Kubernetes level at traditional Kubernetes RBAC, but all that is being managed and controlled within your visibility. We go up another level. We were talking about clusters and attaching. So I can go back to cluster groups, select my own. And many of y'all said you have bare metal, you also have other. It's important to restate that any Kubernetes conformant cluster, so anything that passes the CNCF conformance test, which is an open source project from VMware called Sonabuoy, can be attached. So all of the policies that we're talking about can help rein in control. So if you have long-lived clusters, maybe you don't know what to do with them, maybe you no longer want to update them, or maybe you just want to gain visibility, these can be done very effectively just by adding a cluster via the attach command. So we could do Tanzu, needs to be all lowercase. We're going to select the cluster group we want to apply. In this case, I've already selected it. We can add a description, demo cluster, and then we can click next. And an important configuration that Morgan highlighted, a common fail point for some of our customers is just, are they using a proxy? And if they are, this is where we can toggle that on, and then we can select one, and I'll show you how to add that next. In this case, we select next. And then now I have a simple command. And whether you're a vSphere shop, a bare metal, EKS, etc., all this can be run very effectively just by copying this to the clipboard, or if you want to actually view the YAML that's available, you could save that as well. But this one line can run in your cluster, and then it will kick off the connection. I'm going to exit out of that. And you can see that it's starting the process. If my hands-on labs is still, let's see, I was going to do live for y'all. So while that's spinning back up, we were talking about a common fail point is proxies, and we can see under the administration section, we have a list of options, in this case, proxy. And this is where if your environment requires a proxy and it's in use, you can create the proxy configuration. Give it a name, give it the details, username, password, and click create. And then as you attach or create clusters, you can toggle that on and select the applicable proxy. Another common challenge that we see with cluster configurations is just how can you standardize? So for example, many of our customers have a variety of ingress controllers that they may be using, and there's over 20 in the CNCF landscape, and that's a good thing. But from an operator standpoint, how do you simplify and have consistent experiences? And so that's where you could select and configure clusters. Just this is a list of options that we support out of the box today coming from a repo. You could attach your own repo on the back end. And then, for example, you could standardize the configuration for your ingress controllers, which is a common pain point and a question we're asked. So I see a list of questions here. I'm going to pause.
I can read them.
Oh, thank you.
I think
good questions.
Okay. Yeah, good questions. We're adding them to the chat at the end. There's one that maybe we want to just quickly demonstrate, which is how do I integrate with Tanzu observability? Yeah,
good question. So I'm going to select the cluster. Let's pick this top one here. You can see on the far right, integrations is here. And so this is an attached cluster. We can see it's covered here as attached. And then we see the overall health. In this case, some of the details, this is running on Google Cloud. We see the Kubernetes version. We see the health. Morgan talked about agents that get installed. These are the controller manager, etcd, et cetera. And then here's the actual TMC extensions. And so these are pulling in the health data, and then if it's a provision cluster, the lifecycle. And as part of this visibility, we have the option to add integrations. Today we have 2, there's more coming. So we have Tanzu Observability and Tanzu Service Mesh. And this is where we can see that this has already been deployed and it's healthy. But this is where if this wasn't, we would just click add, select, and then it would automatically integrate. Jim, how did that answer your question?
Oh yeah, you could also, while we're waiting, yeah, if you go to a cluster group, you also have the ability, and this is going back to that data model power, to choose a specific cluster group. And as Ryan's showing, you can choose a cluster group to add the integration, and this would apply it to every single cluster in that cluster group.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. So thinking about scale, how do you standardize the configurations so that everything is consistent, same configuration throughout? And this is a way that you would automatically inherit that configuration via policy. And all of your clusters will be fitting back your metrics for your clusters, both at the platform layer, and then you could also configure applications to do the same. All right, we're going to try and do a live. So I've logged into Hands-On Labs. This is a Tanzu Kubernetes grid cluster, but this could be bare metal. This could be EKS. I'm going to run this attach command. And we can see that it's starting to run through the process. And then now on the mission control side, if we go back to my cluster group, that will start running in the background to attach. So Julia Child's approach. It's created. Okay. And then what else? Looking at the questions here. Observability. And then what we'll see in the next session. So we've been talking about access from a policy standpoint. But But then you could also take this a level in terms of additional security policies, and that's what we'll tee up next. And so to give you a primer for what Corey will be talking about, how can you kind of get started with just doing simple pod security policies, as well as you can have a variety of items. And the beauty of Mission Control is on the VMware side, everything is upstream first. So there's upstream projects behind Mission Control. So we saw Flux CD in the catalog. There's also Cluster API. But in this case, from a security standpoint, there's an open source project called Open Policy Agent. And so this allows you to do, the sky is the limit in terms of what you could do. So a common item that I've seen customers apply to their end users is how can you reinforce good guardrails for common application challenges? So for example, those new to Kubernetes may not always have the infrastructure background of single points of failure, for example. So you could have a policy that requires every application deployment to have a minimum of 2 replicas. So you don't have a single point of failure. And then you let Kubernetes do the work of enforcing that declared state. And this is something you could do via a template, and then you could apply that via policy. And then another common ask is backups. And so as people adopt Kubernetes and they start adopting stateful applications, this is where we could add a credential. In this case, we can have an S3 for Amazon or Azure Blob are 2 of our backup targets. And then if we think of going back to the policy, we can select a cluster. So in this case, we'll go back to this 121, and then we can set up data protection. So a common ask is, how can I improve DR? How can I improve availability? And while there are many ways, and admin Ryan recommends doing that at the application level, this will allow you to do backups of the Kubernetes state. So this is taking a backup of that CD, the persistent volume claims, the namespace configurations. And then in a future release of Mission Control, you'll be able to restore that into a different cluster. Today, you can restore it back to the same cluster. We wanted to leave you all with more educational resources. So a common ask for many getting started is, Docker, Kubernetes, open source, oh my. So there's an online resource inspired by Khan Academy. These are bite-sized modules to learn different topics, and they start at the very foundational level and go all the way up to certification. So Cube Academy has a list of very esteemed education providers, everyone from Joe Bita to Scott Lowell, just some real titans, both in the VMware community as well as the Kubernetes community. We also talked about the documentation. Tanzu Mission Control has a troubleshooting resources that we've linked in this deck, but this provides a list of getting started guides, deployment guides, and even reference architectures. Below that, we have the Tanzu Developer Center. Despite the name, this is actually more open source focused, just like Cube Academy. Everything there is completely agnostic. Tanzu Developer Center gives you hands-on resources as well as guides for either writing applications or maybe adopting event-driven systems like Knative, serverless. So there's a list of resources in terms of hands-on playground, as well as diving deeper into reading or even watching videos on how do I take let's, for example, a .NET application into .NET Core so I can run it on Linux. And then lastly, we have VMware Pathfinder. For those familiar with hands-on labs that I was just in, that is kind of the new kind of overarching brand for all of our Tanzu specific and VMware specific labs. As an example, if you go to Pathfinder, you'll have an example where you have the option to try a lab, and you could select hands-on labs. You could do a search. In this case, you could select app modernization, and then there are a list of Tanzu specific hands-on labs. So everything from Container 101 to learning Tanzu Kubernetes Grid to learning Tanzu Mission Control. And then we can go beyond with how do I manage operations at scale with Tanzu for Kubernetes operations, or there's also a more developer focused lab called Tanzu for developers. And then we have a full Tanzu application platform lab as well. And then now we'll go to open questions.
So please
Daniel
keep
asked
adding
about
questions.
what if.
And also please keep adding questions if they come up.
Daniel, were you asking about the dry run command for substitute for what if?
I think this was we could recommend changing the language instead of it being a dry run mode to say like, consider framing this in the product as a what if mode.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, that's good feedback. And for those for unfamiliar, I asked just to make sure we were being clear, but a dry run allows you to test a policy without actually doing the deployment. There's a reference in the overall community called shift left, but that is empowering those to do the recommended practice. So stay within the guardrails, but give you the knowledge up front. So for example, with a dry run command, I could do a deployment and immediately get the response back saying it was denied and what policy denied it. So in this case, maybe I'm trying to deploy an application that's pulling a random container from Docker Hub, and that container has a crypto miner in it, or that container has a privileged access, or maybe it's requesting root access, but the policy is saying no root access, no privilege access, or maybe your company has a policy that is requiring for security all your containers to be deployed from a trusted source. And then Mike, is it Michelle or Michael is asking, can we set cluster roles and cluster role bindings? Yes, through the access, you can set, we were actually creating a role binding in the demo example. And then there's another question. I have a cluster that attach right now. We did a deattach and we did a reattach with the packages that were installed, but they can't be managed. Corey, did you want to chime in there or for the most recent one?
I think for both of those, we'd probably want to spend some time offline and see if we can figure out what's going on.
Yeah, the bottom one sounds like in a loop. Okay.
Yeah, not sure if it's the best place to do that on this particular presentation, but I definitely want to follow up and see if we can figure out what's going on and get everything squared away.
Yep, that's a good topic. Yeah, if you want to ping us, I'm trying to think the best way, but if you want to send us your email and we'll follow up with you just in the chat. And then Jim asked about how integrating with Tanzu observability. We ran through that in the demo. So for those that we didn't get to, the chat is live. Feel free to chime in. Or if there's a topic you want to see in a future Tanzu office hours. So this is the first. Our second session is with Corey, who's on the line, and we'll be diving deeper into the world of policies. But what would you like to see next? So this was the first step in a set of common questions we see in the field. But what should we do next? And this is open mic, ask us anything. What would you like to see next, or what would you like answered today? Yeah, general troubleshooting, that's a good one.
Everyone else must still need more coffee.
Well, with no more questions, we will progress to the next slide and we'll tee up our next session. So Corey's on the line, but I did want to make a plug for him. This will be more of guidance. So common questions we've seen in the field is how do you start applying security policies? And particularly for those who are scaling up from a couple of clusters to 100 clusters, or I really do have a large CRM customer in San Francisco with over 10,000 Kubernetes clusters. How do you consistently apply security, both from an audit, InfoSec, as well as just from an operations? How do you simplify the management? So Corey's going to dive into that. So bring your questions, your examples, and we will answer them live. And this deck will be provided. So we have some additional resources in terms of learning paths, more documentation, white papers, how do you kind of wrangle fleet operations as we refer to it. For those who want to continue learning, our Twitter community is here. So this pumps out a variety of topics. We also have the VMware code community. So I mentioned earlier the YAML for the templates. So that content will be posted there. And a lot of this is built off the community itself, just as an open source ecosystem, which is also where you can find us. So on the Kubernetes Slack community as well, which we have linked here. So we value your feedback and we appreciate your time. Thank you.